I wasn't in that room when it happened, but I've had it described to me enough times, since first by Nathan Cole, who got the call from the energy company's attorney office within the hour, and later by Ryan himself sitting across from me with his voice breaking in a way I'd never heard before, that I can see it now almost like I was standing there. The phone rang at 11:40 at night, and Ryan's hands were shaking so bad, according to what he told me weeks later, that he almost dropped it on the marble floor of that new house he'd bought. With money he didn't have yet. Not officially, not until the deal closed. The voice on the other end belonged to a lawyer named Whitfield, representing the energy company that was supposed to hand my son $18 million in exchange for 600 acres of West Texas ranch land. Whitfield's voice was flat and clinical, the way lawyers talk when they're about to ruin someone's life and don't want to seem like they enjoy it. He told Ryan the deal was dead. He told him the land had no water rights attached to it, none at all, and without water there was no cattle, no drilling, no development, nothing but dry dirt worth a fraction of what he'd promised his investors. Jessica came running from the kitchen, still holding a glass of wine, and when she heard him repeat the words, "No water rights," she went pale in a way Ryan said he'd never seen on her before. Not even close. But that phone call didn't come out of nowhere, and I want you to understand something about how these things actually work before I take you back to where this story really begins. A deal worth $18 million doesn't close overnight. It takes months, sometimes longer, while lawyers on every side crawl through title records, geological surveys, water district filings, easements, and every other piece of paper buried in a county courthouse basement. That kind of due diligence, as they call it, had been quietly grinding forward for nearly 3 months, by the time that phone rang, mostly out of sight, mostly ignored by two people who were already spending money they didn't legally have yet. Because that's exactly what Ryan and Jessica had been doing during those 3 months, celebrating early. I thought about that new truck and that new Tesla people around town had already started talking about, mentioned to me once by the cashier at the feed store, 2 brand new vehicles paid for with money that didn't exist. Yet money still tied up in lawyers' offices and due diligence reports, neither of them had bothered to read closely. They put a deposit down on a house outside Austin with a wine cellar and a view of the hill country, confident the money was already as good as sitting in their account at Chase Bank. Confidence, I've learned over 71 years, is a dangerous thing to spend before it's earned. Now let me take you back 3 months earlier to the morning I found out exactly how far that confidence had already gone. I drove out to the ranch that morning, the same way I had for 45 years, in my old Ford pickup with rust creeping along the wheel wells and a bench seat that still smelled faintly of hay and diesel. The gate at the front of my own property was closed, which wasn't unusual, except there was a padlock on it I had never seen before. Shiny and new, the kind you buy at a hardware store, the same week you decide to lock somebody out of their own life. Standing beside the gate was a man in a dark polo shirt, with a company logo I didn't recognize, arms crossed, sunglasses on, even though the morning was overcast. He told me politely enough that I wasn't authorized to be on the property. I asked him whose authority he was talking about. He said Mr. Ryan Brooks and Mrs. Jessica Brooks. I sat there in my truck for a long moment, engine idling, looking past that guard toward the house where I'd raised my son, where I'd buried his mother's ashes under the oak tree she used to sit beneath every evening with a glass of sweet tea. I didn't argue with the guard. I never raised my voice, and I wasn't about to start over a locked gate. I just nodded, turned the truck around, and drove back into town, and somewhere behind me, unseen and unfinished, a due diligence process was still crawling forward closer every single day to uncovering the one thing my son and his wife had never once thought to ask about. I want to promise you something right now, the same way I promised myself that morning. Whatever they thought they had won by locking that gate, they hadn't understood the first thing about what they were standing on. And before this story is over, you're going to watch two people who thought they were smarter than an old man learn exactly what happens when greed signs a contract it never bothered to fully read. 3 months before that padlock ever went on my gate, Ryan and Jessica pulled into my driveway in his old work truck, the same dusty gray Ford he'd been driving since college, and walked into my kitchen looking like two people carrying something heavy they'd rehearsed how to set down gently. Ryan sat across from me at my own kitchen table and told me it was time for me to retire. He said it soft, the way you'd tell somebody their dog was sick and wasn't getting better. Daddy said, "You're 71 years old. You've given this ranch everything you have. Let somebody else carry it now." Jessica sat beside him, quiet. At first, her manicured hands folded on the table like she was at a business meeting instead of her father-in-law's kitchen. She used to sell houses for a living back before she married into whatever she thought this family was worth, and she still had that real estate agent's way of looking at a room like she was already calculating square footage and resale value even while sitting in it. I remember looking at my son's face and seeing pieces of his mother in it, the same jaw, the same way his eyebrows pulled together when he was nervous, and for one long moment I almost believed he meant it out of love. Almost. Then Jessica leaned forward just slightly and said, "There was a company out of Houston interested in the land, an energy outfit, planning a large-scale solar and wind development across the western portion of the property, with additional plans to run heavy construction operations for turbine foundations and access roads across the eastern acreage." I asked how much water a project like that would need. Jessica waved her hand like I'd asked something irrelevant. "Dad," she said, "it's solar panels and windmills, not an oil rig. It's not like they're drilling anything." I let that pass without correcting her, though I already knew better, having spent 30 years drafting contracts for exactly this kind of development. Wind and solar farms don't drink water the way cattle or crops do. That much is true, but building one is another matter entirely. Concrete for turbine foundations has to be mixed on site, and mixing concrete at that scale takes staggering amounts of water. Dust suppression across miles of new access roads during construction takes even more. And beyond all of that, every county across West Texas, mine included, requires any commercial development project, regardless of what it produces once it's finished, to demonstrate a sustainable water source before the permitting office will approve a single shovel going into the ground. It's written into the Groundwater Conservation District rules, plain as day, and has been for decades. Ever since the drought years taught this part of the state a hard lesson about promising more than the land could give. Ryan told me the number then. $18 million, he said, and his voice cracked just slightly on the word million, like even he couldn't quite believe it out loud. I didn't answer right away. I looked out the kitchen window at the pasture where Margaret used to walk every evening before supper, at the oak tree where I'd scattered part of her ashes at 600 acres that had swallowed every dollar I ever made as a real estate attorney, before I walked away from that career to build something with my own hands, instead of just paperwork for other men's dreams. "Dad," Ryan said again, softer this time, "you don't have to run yourself into the ground anymore. Let us handle it. Let us take care of you. Take care of me." I turned those words over slowly in my mind, the way you'd turn over a stone looking for what's crawling underneath it. Because taking care of somebody and taking something from somebody can sound remarkably similar if you say them with the right amount of gentleness in your voice. I told them I'd think about it. I told them I needed time. And I watched something flicker behind Jessica's eyes, something that wasn't patience, something closer to irritation, the look of a woman who had already mentally spent that $18 million on a house in Austin with a wine cellar and a pool shaped like something out of a magazine. They left that night in the same dusty gray work truck they'd arrived in, tires kicking up dust down my gravel driveway. Nothing new about it at all. Nothing to suggest yet how quickly that would change. I stood on my porch a long while after their taillights disappeared, listening to nothing but crickets and the distant sound of cattle settling in for the night, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not anger exactly. Something quieter and colder than that. I want you to understand something about me before we go any further into this story. I spent 30 years practicing real estate law before I ever laid one fence post on this land, and in all those years I learned one lesson that never once failed me. People rarely take what belongs to somebody else through violence or shouting. They take it through paperwork, through patience, through convincing you that giving up is the same thing as being loved. My son believed with everything in his heart that he was doing right by me. His wife believed she was simply being practical. And somewhere between the two of them, sitting at my own kitchen table with sweet tea going warm in front of us, they made a decision that would cost them far more than either one could imagine. And they never once thought to ask the one question that would have saved them from all of it. They never asked what exactly they were buying. The very week after that dinner, I made a decision of my own, one nobody asked me to make. I packed up most of my clothes, a few boxes of Margaret's things I couldn't bear to leave sitting in an empty house, and I moved into a small 2-bedroom rental on 5th Street in town, telling myself it was simply the decent thing to do, giving a young couple room to settle into a home without an old man's boots tracking mud across the porch every morning. I want you to remember that detail because it matters later. I left that ranch on my own 2 feet out of grace long before anybody ever thought to put a padlock on my gate. The 3 months between that kitchen table conversation and the padlock passed in a way I can only describe as quiet erosion, like watching a riverbank give way one small piece at a time, until you look up one day and realize half the shore is gone. Ryan started handling things. That's the phrase he used, handling things, as if 45 years of my life were a stack of paperwork sitting on somebody's desk waiting to be filed. He brought over documents for me to sign, transfer of management authority, power of attorney, over certain operational decisions, small things, at first things, that seemed reasonable coming from a son, trying to ease his aging father's burden. Jessica sat in on every single meeting, always with a legal pad, always taking notes, always smiling in that professional way. She used to smile at open house showings. I signed most of what they asked. Not because I was foolish, and not because I didn't see exactly what was happening. I signed because I understood something they didn't yet understand about themselves. Now let me ask you something, and I want you to really think about this before you keep listening. If you were sitting where I was sitting those 3 months watching your own son slide papers across the table for you to sign, papers that were slowly moving your life's work out of your hands and into his, would you have grabbed a pen and fought him right there at that kitchen table? Would you have raised your voice, called a lawyer of your own, made it a war right from the very first document? Or would you have done what I did and simply smiled and signed and waited? I want to tell you exactly why I chose silence. Because it wasn't weakness and it wasn't surrender, no matter how it might have looked from the outside. 30 years of practicing real estate law teaches you to read documents the way a doctor reads an X-ray, seeing things other people walk right past without noticing. On the 3rd meeting, Ryan brought over a draft of the eventual sale agreement his lawyers had prepared for the energy company, wanting my informal opinion on the language, still treating me, at least on paper, as some kind of consultant, even as they stripped away my authority piece by piece. I read through it slowly at my kitchen table, while Jessica watched me with that patient, slightly condescending patience people use with the elderly. And there it was, buried in language dense enough that most people would skim right past it. The agreement transferred surface rights and mineral exploration rights. It said nothing, not one single word, about water rights. In the state of Texas, land and water can be legally separated, held by different owners entirely, and back in 1988, long before Ryan was even out of high school, I had done exactly that. I severed the water rights beneath this ranch from the surface land itself through a legal instrument as old and as quiet as anything sitting in a courthouse filing cabinet. And I held on to that water like a man holds on to the one thing he knows will matter more than anything else someday. Neither Ryan nor Jessica, for all her real estate experience, for all her confidence reading contracts, ever thought to check what exactly they were preparing to sell. They saw 600 acres of grazing land and dreamed about wind turbines and solar panels and $18 million. They never once asked the question that any competent water rights attorney would have asked on day one. Where does the water for this land actually come from, and who legally owns it? If I had objected right then at that kitchen table, if I had raised my voice and said this deal is worthless without water rights, Ryan would have called his lawyers immediately, and somebody competent would have caught the gap before any contract ever got signed. They would have come to me hat in hand and negotiated properly, and none of what was coming would have ever happened. So I said nothing. I smiled the way I always do, and I let them walk forward into a mistake they didn't know they were making, because some lessons cannot be taught with words. Some lessons only take root when the ground gives way beneath your own feet, and you finally understand too late to fix it exactly what you were standing on all along. The morning I found the padlock on my gate wasn't really the beginning of anything, not truthfully. It was simply the moment 3 months of small signatures and gentle conversations hardened into something you could touch with your own hands. Cold metal and a stranger standing guard over land my father had bought with money. He'd saved working oil fields in the 1950s. The guard's name, I learned later, was Dale, hired through a private security firm out of Midland that the energy company insisted on before finalizing anything, worried about liability, worried about an old rancher wandering onto land that was about to become a multi-million-dollar investment property. Dale didn't know who I was, not really. He'd been told an elderly former owner might show up occasionally and to keep the property secure until closing. I drove to the house instead, taking the long way around on the county road, and found Ryan and Jessica standing in the driveway beside a moving truck, watching 2 men carry boxes labeled with a storage company's logo toward the front door. Parked beside that moving truck, gleaming in the morning light, were 2 vehicles I hadn't seen with my own eyes until that very moment: a lifted Ford F-150 King Ranch, traded up from the old work truck sometime in those 3 months, and beside it a white Tesla Model X with paper dealer plates still taped inside the back window. So there it was, finally in front of me, exactly what that feed store cashier had been talking about. Ryan looked up and saw me, and something crossed his face. Not quite guilt, more like the particular discomfort of a man caught rearranging furniture in a house he hasn't fully paid for yet. "Dad," he said, walking toward my truck window, "we were going to call you this week, explain everything properly." Explain what properly, I asked, though I already knew, and my voice stayed exactly as calm as it always does, because there is no version of anger that would have served me better in that moment than patience. Jessica stepped forward before Ryan could answer. Her arms crossed, sunglasses pushed up into her hair, and she said the words, "I still hear sometimes late at night when I can't sleep. The ranch belongs to the future now, Ethan. It's time you understood that." I sat in that truck for a long moment, looking past her at the house, at the oak tree in the distance where Margaret's ashes rested beneath the roots, at the pasture fence I'd rebuilt with my own 2 hands after the flood of 2007. And I felt something settle inside me, cold and clear and absolutely certain. I asked her one simple question. I asked if they'd had the water rights formally reviewed before signing anything with the energy company's attorneys. Jessica laughed, actually laughed a short, sharp sound with no warmth in it at all. "Ethan," she said, "water isn't complicated. It comes with the land. Everybody knows that." I nodded slowly, the way you nod at somebody who has just told you something profoundly wrong, with complete confidence, and I didn't correct her. Ryan told me almost gently that Dale would let me visit the house whenever I wanted, as a courtesy, as long as I called ahead first. As a courtesy. Those words landed on me heavier than anything Jessica had said, because courtesy is what you extend to strangers, not to the man who raised you. Not to the man whose name was still legally on the deed itself, though clearly not for much longer in their minds. I put the truck in gear and drove away for the second time that month, past the padlock, past the guard who tipped his hat at me without knowing who I was, past the life I had built with a woman who was no longer here to see what her only son had allowed to happen in her absence. I didn't cry. I want you to know that because I think it matters. What I felt instead was something far quieter and far more dangerous to anyone standing on the wrong side of it. I felt patient. Nathan Cole had been my lawyer for going on 22 years, and before that, back when I still practiced real estate law myself, he'd been the young associate I trained fresh out of law school. His office sat above a hardware store on Main Street, the same building it had occupied since the 1990s, with a window unit air conditioner that rattled every time it kicked on, and a waiting room that still smelled faintly of the coffee he brewed too strong every single morning. I drove there straight from the ranch, still feeling that strange, cold patience settle deep in my chest. And Nathan looked up from his desk, the moment I walked in, setting down his reading glasses with the particular expression of a man who already senses trouble before a single word gets spoken. "Ethan," he said, "you look like a man who just watched something he built get taken apart." I sat down across from him and told him everything: the padlock the guard named, Dale Jessica's laughter, Ryan's talk of courtesy visits to the house I'd lived in for 45 years. Nathan listened without interrupting, the way good lawyers learn to do, letting silence do some of the work that questions usually do. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and asked me the only question that mattered. He asked if they knew about the water. I told him no. I told him Jessica genuinely believed water simply came bundled with land ownership, the way most ordinary people assume it does, never having reason to learn otherwise. I told him Ryan had never once, in 3 months of paperwork and meetings, asked me a single question about the 1988 severance agreement. The document sitting quietly in a folder in my safety deposit box. The document that legally separated all water rights beneath those 600 acres from the surface land itself, granting me and only me permanent ownership of every drop of groundwater under that ranch. Nathan pulled out a manila folder from his own filing cabinet, one he'd kept for me all these years exactly as I'd asked, containing certified copies of everything. The original severance agreement notarized and recorded properly with the county. Geological survey maps showing the aquifer beneath the property, the same aquifer that fed every well, every stock tank, every irrigation line on that ranch. Water use permits filed decades ago through the Regional Groundwater Conservation District. All in my name, all perfectly legal, all completely untouched by anything Ryan or Jessica had signed or were about to sign. Nathan asked me the question I knew was coming. He asked if I wanted him to intervene now before any sale went through, to send a formal notice to the energy company's attorneys, clarifying the water rights situation before somebody got seriously hurt. I told him no, not yet. He studied me for a long moment, the same way he used to study contracts, back when he was my associate looking for what might be hiding underneath the surface language. He asked me why. I told him something I believed then, and still believe now, sitting here telling you this story. Some lessons cannot be given to a person. They have to be earned the hard way through consequence, because a lesson handed over freely gets forgotten by morning, but a lesson paid for in full never leaves a person for the rest of their life. My son had spent his whole adult life believing that speed and confidence were the same thing as wisdom. His wife had spent her career believing that reading a contract quickly was the same thing as understanding it. Neither one of them had ever been forced to sit still long enough to ask what they didn't know. I asked Nathan to do one thing for me. I asked him to simply wait and watch and keep that folder exactly where it was until the moment came when it would matter most. He nodded slowly, the way an old friend nods when he understands he's watching something unfold that he has no right to rush. I left his office that afternoon and drove back toward the small rental house in town, the same rental house I'd chosen for myself out of grace 3 months earlier, never once imagining that quiet gesture would end with a stranger guarding my own front gate. I drove past fields I no longer legally controlled, but still in every way that truly mattered, owned completely. Somewhere out there, $18 million was moving through lawyers and bankers and eager investors, all of them building a future on land they believed was whole. They had bought 600 acres of Texas dirt. What they hadn't bought, what they had never even thought to ask about, was the one thing underneath it all that made any of that dirt worth a single dollar. I met Margaret in the summer of 1976, back when I was a second-year law student, working a clerkship at a small firm in Lubbock that handled nothing but land disputes, water rights cases, and the occasional oil lease dispute between families who'd been feuding over the same quarter section of dirt for 3 generations. She worked the front desk at a diner near the courthouse, and I ordered the same lunch every single day for 2 months before I finally worked up the nerve to ask her out, a fact she never let me forget for the rest of our marriage. But before I tell you about her, and before I tell you about the water beneath our land, I need to take you back to the 6 weeks right after that dinner where Ryan asked me to retire. Because everything that happened next only makes sense once you understand how fast 2 people can spend money that isn't fully theirs yet. 6 weeks after that kitchen table conversation, Ryan called me to say the preliminary agreement was signed, and there was a note of pride in his voice I hadn't heard since he was a boy, bringing home a report card full of good grades. He didn't invite me to the celebration dinner, not that I expected him to, but Nathan Cole heard about it later through the local grapevine, the way everything eventually makes its way around a county this small, and he told me the details over coffee a few days after. They'd driven to Houston for it, to a steakhouse downtown with white tablecloths and a wine list thicker than most Bibles, the kind of place where a ribeye costs more than I used to make in a week, back when I was cutting my teeth in real estate law. The energy company sent 3 representatives, sharp young men in suits that fit too well along with their attorney, and somewhere in the middle of that dinner papers got signed that committed the company, pending final due diligence, to purchasing the ranch for $18 million through a limited liability company they'd registered in Delaware. The way most of these outfits structure their deals to keep the tax exposure as thin as possible. Along with the signature came something more immediate than a promise on paper. The energy company wired a non-refundable $50,000 signing bonus into Ryan and Jessica's new account at Chase Bank within 3 business days, standard practice apparently, when a company wants to lock down an exclusive option on a piece of land while its own lawyers finish crawling through the fine print. It wasn't the $18 million. It wasn't even close. But $50,000 landing overnight in an account that had never held more than a few $1,000s at a time has a particular way of making a young couple feel like the rest of the money is already as good as theirs. Jessica ordered champagne before the appetizers even arrived, according to what Nathan heard, confident enough in the outcome that she'd already started scrolling through real estate listings in Austin on her phone at the table, tagging houses with wine cellars and views of the hill country, like she was picking out curtains for a life that hadn't happened yet. I want you to understand something about my son in that moment, because I don't believe he was a cruel man, not then and not now. Ryan genuinely believed, sitting there with a glass raised to a toast, that he was finally proving something to himself, that he was stepping out from under the shadow of a father who'd spent 45 years quietly succeeding at something Ryan never fully understood. 2 days after the wire cleared, Ryan walked into a dealership in Midland and put $12,000 of that signing bonus down on a lifted Ford F-150 King Ranch. financing the remainder against his regular income the way any working man might, except this time, the loan officer barely blinked at the numbers. Once Ryan mentioned almost casually the pending $18 million sale sitting in escrow discussions. Jessica did the same 3 days later, walking into a Tesla dealership with $15,000 down and a printout of the signed preliminary agreement folded in her purse like a paycheck she hadn't fully earned yet. What remained of that $50,000 went toward a deposit on the house outside Austin, and the rest sat in that Chase account waiting, they believed, for $18 million more to follow it. I sat with Nathan in his office listening to all of this, and I felt something strange settle over me. Not satisfaction exactly, because there's nothing satisfying about watching your own child walk toward a cliff he doesn't know is there. It was closer to grief, the particular kind of grief you feel watching somebody you love spend money that was never fully theirs to spend, against a promise that hadn't finished being tested yet. Nathan asked me again gently if I wanted him to send a letter now before things went further, before more of that signing bonus got spent against a deal that was built on a foundation that didn't exist. I told him the same thing I'd told him before. Not yet. He didn't push me on it, though I could see the concern behind his eyes, the same concern an old friend carries when he watches you walk a path he isn't sure you'll come back from clean. He asked me one more question before I left his office that day. He asked if I was doing this to punish Ryan. I thought about that question for a long time, driving home past the feed store and the diner and the church Margaret and I had attended every Sunday for 3.5 decades. I decided somewhere along that drive that punishment wasn't the right word for what I was doing, and it still isn't. I wasn't trying to hurt my son. I was trying to let a truth that already existed, a truth buried in paperwork from 1988, finally speak for itself in a way that no amount of arguing between us ever could. Some fathers teach their sons through words. My own father taught me through the land itself, through drought years and flood years, through watching cattle die when the well ran dry one August, when I was 19 years old, a summer that taught me more about the value of water than any law school class ever did. I couldn't hand Ryan that same lesson through a conversation at a kitchen table. I could only give him the conditions and wait and let the land teach him the way it had once taught me. We married 2 years after I met Margaret at that diner, right after I finished my law degree, and she moved with me out to this stretch of West Texas where my father had already been running cattle for 20 years on land his own father had homesteaded back before the Second World War. I practiced real estate law in town, mostly drafting contracts for ranchers and small landowners who couldn't afford the big firms in Dallas, while Margaret taught 4th grade at the elementary school, and slowly, patiently fell in love with a piece of dirt she used to tease me about calling the middle of nowhere. The drought of 1987 changed something in me that I don't think I ever fully explained to anybody, not even to Margaret, though she lived through it right alongside me. We watched 3 ranching families we'd known our whole lives lose everything that year. Not because they'd done anything wrong, not because they were careless or foolish, but because the water beneath their land had been sold off decades earlier by grandfathers who never imagined a summer that dry, never imagined a summer where the cattle tanks ran to mud and cracked earth by the middle of July. I represented one of those families in court, trying to help them understand what had happened to their own property. And it was during that case that I truly understood for the first time in my legal career that water and land are not the same thing in the eyes of the law, no matter how much most people assume they are. That case sat with me for months afterward. I remember lying awake beside Margaret one night in the spring of 1988, staring at the ceiling fan turning slow circles above our bed, and telling her I wanted to sever the water rights beneath our own land before Ryan was even old enough to understand what land meant. She asked me why, since we had no plans then to ever sell, no reason to think our own son would need protecting from anything. I told her something that night I still believe with everything in me. I told her that the things that matter most in this life rarely announce themselves in advance. I told her I wanted to make sure that whatever happened to this family, whatever choices got made after I was gone, the water beneath our land would always answer to somebody who understood exactly what it was worth. We drove into town together the following week, and I drafted the severance agreement myself, my own hand on the pen, filing it properly with the county the way any competent attorney would, keeping the water rights permanently separated from the surface land and recorded solely in my name. Margaret signed as a witness. I remember she asked me, half joking, if I thought our own son would ever forgive me for a decision like that if he ever found out. I told her I hoped he'd never need to find out at all, that I hoped it would simply sit quietly in a filing cabinet for the rest of our lives, a piece of paper that never mattered, because nobody ever tried to take what wasn't rightfully theirs to take. Margaret passed 6 years ago on a Tuesday morning in October, in the same bedroom where we'd had that conversation about water rights nearly 4 decades earlier. I scattered a portion of her ashes beneath the oak tree in the front pasture 11 months after the funeral. And now looking back, it's been nearly 5 years since that quiet afternoon under the branches. 5 years of watching that tree grow another ring while I grow a little older beside it. The same tree she used to sit under every evening with a glass of sweet tea, watching the sun go down over land she'd grown to love more fiercely than the town she'd been born in. I think about her often now, more than I probably should admit, especially on evenings when the light hits that pasture just right, and I can almost see her sitting there, patient as ever, waiting for me to finish whatever chore had kept me out past supper. I wonder sometimes what she would have said to Ryan sitting across from him at that kitchen table watching him ask his own father to step aside. I like to believe she would have understood my silence the same way she understood that decision back in 1988, trusting that some protections only reveal their purpose long after the person who built them is gone. I had moved into that rental house in town the week after the dinner, where Ryan asked me to retire, and it was entirely my own decision, not his. I told myself at the time that it was simply the decent thing to do, giving a young couple room to settle into a house without an old man's boots tracking mud across the porch every morning. I packed my clothes, a few boxes of Margaret's things I couldn't bring myself to leave behind, and drove into town to a small 2-bedroom rental on 5th Street, never once imagining that a gesture I intended as grace would eventually be repaid with a padlock 3 months later. That's a lesson too, I suppose, one more thing I didn't fully understand until it was already sitting behind me. I found out about the garden almost by accident several weeks after that padlock had already gone up, the way most painful things find their way to you when you're not looking for them. A neighbor named Ellis, a man who'd leased grazing rights on the parcel next to mine for going on 15 years, stopped by the diner in town, where I'd taken to eating breakfast most mornings, and he mentioned almost in passing that he'd seen a dumpster parked in my old driveway earlier that week, filled with what looked like furniture and boxes. I asked him what kind of furniture. He said he couldn't be sure, but he thought he'd seen a rocking chair thrown on top of the pile. The kind with hand-carved armrests, the kind you don't buy at a regular furniture store. I knew immediately which chair he meant. Margaret's mother had given us that rocking chair as a wedding gift in 1978, carved by her own grandfather back in Tennessee, and Margaret had rocked both of our grandchildren in that chair, before either one of us knew we'd only get to see them a handful of times, before Ryan and his first wife moved out to California, back before Jessica ever came into the picture. I drove out to the ranch that afternoon. Dale was still on duty at the gate, and for a moment I thought he might stop me the way his instructions plainly required him to. But he only glanced my way once, then looked down at his clipboard like something on it suddenly needed his full attention, and the gate stayed open long enough for me to drive through without either of us having to say a single word about it. I've thought about that small mercy many times since the particular kindness of a stranger who chooses not to see what his job tells him he's supposed to see. What I found in that driveway confirmed everything Ellis had described, and worse. The dumpster was gone by then, already hauled off, but Jessica was standing near the garden Margaret had planted almost 30 years earlier, directing two landscaping workers who were tearing out rows of rose bushes and heirloom tomato plants that had been cultivated from seeds passed down through 3 generations of women in my family. Jessica saw me and didn't look the least bit ashamed. She explained in that same patient, slightly condescending tone she used whenever she thought she was being reasonable with somebody who simply didn't understand modern priorities, that the energy company's site plan called for a staging area right where the garden currently sat, and that most of what had been in the house was, in her words, just old stuff taking up space they'd need for storage before the final walkthrough. Just old stuff. I stood there a long moment, looking at broken rose bushes scattered across dirt Margaret had turned over with her own 2 hands every spring for 3 decades, and I felt something crack open inside me that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with a grief I hadn't fully let myself feel since the funeral. I didn't say much to Jessica that day. I asked her quietly if she'd kept the rocking chair, and she told me it had gone out with the rest of what she called clutter sold or donated somewhere along the way. She couldn't quite remember which. I got back in my truck and drove away without another word, and somewhere on that county road, halfway between the ranch and town, I had to pull over onto the shoulder because my hands were shaking too badly to keep driving safely. I sat there a long time watching the wind move through a field of bluebonnets that had come up early that spring, and I let myself cry for the first time since Margaret passed. Not for the chair, not really, but for the particular kind of loneliness that comes from realizing the people who are supposed to carry your memory forward sometimes carry it carelessly without meaning any real harm simply because they never understood what they were holding. I want to slow down for a moment here because what I'm about to tell you isn't really part of the story in the way everything else has been. It's something closer to a confession, the kind of thing a man only says out loud late at night, or to a stranger he'll never see again, or I suppose to whoever happens to be listening to a voice like mine coming through their earphones on a quiet evening. Have you ever laid awake at 3 in the morning, replaying a conversation you can never take back? I have. More nights than I can count since Margaret passed, and especially in the weeks after finding that garden torn apart. That rocking chair gone without a trace, sold off to strangers who'll never know the hands that carved it. People our age, you and I, we carry a particular kind of weight that younger folks simply haven't earned yet. And I don't say that with any pride, only with a certain tired honesty. We've buried people we loved. We've watched children grow into adults who make choices we never saw coming. Choices that sometimes feel like a quiet rejection of everything we tried to teach them. And somewhere in the middle of all that, most of us have made our own share of mistakes. 2 mistakes we don't talk about, mistakes that sit quiet in the back of our minds during the ordinary hours of the day, only to surface at 3 in the morning when the house is too silent and there's nobody left to distract us from ourselves. I have to tell you something about Ryan that I haven't told you yet. Something that makes all of this harder to carry than it might seem from the outside. There was a stretch of years right after his mother and I moved him out here as a teenager, leaving behind a school and friends he loved back in Lubbock, where I worked so many hours building this ranch that I missed nearly every single one of his high school football games. Margaret used to sit alone in those bleachers most Friday nights, and Ryan used to look up into the stands after every game searching and find only his mother sitting there. I told myself back then that I was building something for his future, that the hours I spent fixing fences and negotiating cattle contracts were an act of love, even if they didn't look like love from where he was standing. Have you ever wished you could turn back the clock, not to fix some enormous mistake, but just to sit in different bleachers on a handful of ordinary Friday nights? I have wished that more times than I could ever properly count. And I wonder sometimes, lying awake in that rental house in town, whether some small part of what happened between Ryan and me, this whole business with the padlock and the contracts and the $18 million, has roots that go back further than any of us want to admit. Maybe a boy who spent his teenage years searching empty bleachers for a father who wasn't there grows into a man who struggles to trust that same father's wisdom even decades later, even when that wisdom might have saved him from disaster. I don't offer this to excuse anything Ryan did. A grown man of 43 bears responsibility for his own choices, regardless of what happened in his childhood, and I believe that with my whole heart. But I offer it to you because I think you understand, maybe better than most, that the wounds we carry from our own families rarely stay in the past where we'd like them to stay. They travel forward with us, quiet and mostly invisible, until one day they show up dressed as something else entirely. A locked gate, a discarded rocking chair, a son who can't quite bring himself to ask his father one simple question before signing away $18 million worth of trust. Margaret used to tell me that love and regret often grow from the exact same root, and I understand that better now than I ever did while she was alive to say it to my face. I miss her most on nights like these when the weight of everything I'm carrying feels too heavy for one old man sitting alone in a rented house waiting for a truth neither of us planted to finally come up through the soil. The energy company's due diligence team brought in a man named Samuel Ortiz sometime in early summer, a water rights consultant out of San Antonio with a reputation, according to Nathan Cole, who'd crossed paths with him professionally years earlier for being meticulous, to the point of stubbornness, the kind of man who wouldn't sign off on a report until every single number matched perfectly with the paper trail behind it. Ortiz had spent 20 years working groundwater conservation cases across the Permian Basin, and companies looking to develop large tracts of West Texas land had learned often the hard way that skipping a proper water assessment could cost them far more down the line than his consulting fee ever would. He arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning in a company truck carrying a tablet loaded with satellite imagery, historical rainfall data, and county groundwater district records going back decades. Ryan met him at the gate himself that day, proud in the way a man gets proud when he believes every remaining obstacle between him and $18 million is nothing more than paperwork formality. He walked Ortiz around the property for most of the morning, pointing out the stock tanks, the old windmill pump near the eastern fence line, the well that had served the main house for as long as Ryan had been alive. Ortiz asked a simple question sometime around midday, the kind of question that sounds almost too basic to matter, right up until it becomes the only question that matters. He asked Ryan for a copy of the water rights documentation, specifically the recorded ownership records showing water rights attached to the surface title. Ryan told him with complete confidence that the water rights came with the land, the same way Jessica had told me, the same assumption most ordinary landowners carry around their whole lives without ever needing to test it against reality. Ortiz nodded, made a note on his tablet, and told Ryan he'd pull the county records himself, just to have everything properly documented for the final report, a routine step, nothing to worry about. It took Ortiz nearly 3 weeks to work through the county groundwater conservation district's filing system, partly because rural Texas counties still keep a considerable portion of their older records on paper and microfilm, rather than digitized databases, and partly because Ortiz, true to his reputation, refused to rush past a single document without confirming its authenticity against the original recorded instrument. He found the severance agreement on a Thursday afternoon, filed properly under Ethan Brooks, dated 1988, recorded with the county clerk's office exactly where it had sat untouched and unchallenged for 38 years. Nathan told me later that Ortiz called the energy company's lead attorney that same evening, and the conversation, according to what eventually made its way back through the grapevine, lasted less than 4 minutes before both men agreed the deal had a serious problem that needed immediate legal review. I want you to understand something about this moment, because it's easy to imagine me sitting somewhere celebrating when I first heard the news, and that wouldn't be an honest picture of what actually happened inside me. I felt something closer to a held breath, finally releasing the particular relief that comes when a truth you've been quietly protecting finally finds its way into the light on its own without you having to force it there yourself. Ryan and Jessica knew nothing yet. They were still driving that F-150 and that Tesla around town, still talking to their financial advisor about the retirement account they planned to fund once the wire transfer came through, still utterly confident that the only thing standing between them and $18 million was a few more weeks of paperwork. Ortiz's discovery didn't immediately blow the whole deal apart, not right away. Due diligence findings like this typically move through layers of legal review before anybody outside a handful of attorneys ever hears about them. Memos passed between offices, calls made to outside counsel specializing in Texas water law. Careful verification to make sure the severance agreement was airtight and impossible to challenge. But the clock had started, and everyone involved in that transaction, everyone except Ryan and Jessica, now understood exactly what stood between them and closing this deal. Somewhere in an office building in Houston, lawyers were beginning to draft the very phone call that would eventually wake my son up at 11:40 at night. Though none of them knew yet just how far he'd already spent money that was never truly his to spend. The morning after that phone call, Ryan drove straight to the energy company's regional office in Midland, still believing, I think, that this was some kind of clerical mistake that a face-to-face conversation could untangle. Nathan told me later once the whole picture had come together through the various channels lawyers use to keep each other informed, that Ryan sat across from 3 attorneys and a senior vice president for nearly 2 hours that morning, and by the end of it, he understood exactly how serious the situation actually was. The energy company's legal team laid it out in terms that left no room for hope. The severance agreement I'd filed back in 1988 was airtight, recorded, properly notarized correctly, and completely unchallengeable under Texas law, and it had sat there untouched for 38 full years. Without the water rights, the land could not support the concrete mixing required for turbine foundations. It could not meet the county's sustainable water source requirement for any commercial development permit. It could not, in the plainest terms available, become anything close to what the company had agreed to pay $18 million for. The deal wasn't simply delayed. It was dead, and worse than dead, because the purchase agreement Ryan had signed contained a standard representation and warranty clause, the kind buried in nearly every commercial real estate contract, where the seller affirms that they possess clear and complete rights to convey everything being sold. Ryan had signed that clause without ever verifying whether it was true, and now the company's attorneys were informing him that this constituted a material misrepresentation, one that opened him up to legal liability far beyond simply losing the deal. The $18 million itself had never actually moved. I want to be clear about that because it matters for understanding exactly what happened next. In a transaction of that size, the purchase money sits untouched in an escrow account until the day of closing, released only once every condition has been satisfied and every document properly recorded. None of that money had ever reached Ryan's hands, and none of it ever would now. But the private equity fund out of Dallas that had committed to backing a portion of the acquisition, the investors quietly brought in during the later stages of due diligence, had already spent real money of their own preparing for a closing they believed was certain. They'd paid for their own independent geological surveys, engineering assessments for the turbine sites, environmental consultants, and legal review, altogether several $100,000 in costs that vanished the moment the deal collapsed. Their attorneys called Ryan's attorney within the week, informing him they intended to pursue him personally for those losses, arguing that his signed misrepresentation about the water rights had directly caused their capital to sit frozen in preparation for a transaction that never should have proceeded in the first place. By that afternoon, the $50,000 signing bonus was the least of anybody's concerns. Ryan owed his attorney's retainer. He owed payments on a Ford F-150 King Ranch and a mortgage deposit on a house outside Austin that suddenly made no financial sense at all without $18 million behind it. Jessica's Tesla payment was due in 11 days, and somewhere in a Dallas office, lawyers representing angry investors were drafting language that used words like fraud and misrepresentation, words that carry weight far beyond ordinary business disappointment. I learned most of this from Nathan over the following week, piece by piece, the way news travels through small towns, where everybody knows somebody who knows somebody. I want to be honest with you about how I felt hearing it, because I think honesty matters more than making myself look wiser or calmer than I actually was in that moment. I felt a strange mixture of things all at once. There was a part of me, and I won't pretend otherwise, that felt something close to vindication. The quiet satisfaction of watching a truth I'd protected for 38 years finally prove its worth. But underneath that, and stronger than that, was a father's plain and simple worry for his son, because whatever mistakes Ryan had made, he was still my boy, still the same child who used to ride on my shoulders through that pasture before he was old enough to walk the fence line himself. Nathan asked me during one of those conversations whether I planned to reach out to Ryan now to explain the water rights before the legal situation got any worse. I told him I still wasn't ready, not because I wanted to see my son suffer, but because I understood something about human nature that 30 years of legal practice had taught me well. A man who has handed the truth too early before he's felt the full weight of his own mistake rarely absorbs the lesson underneath it. He simply feels rescued, and relief has a short memory. I wasn't ready yet to hand Ryan relief. I was waiting for the moment when he was ready to receive something far more valuable than that which was understanding. What none of us knew, yet not me, not Nathan, not even Ryan sitting in that office with his whole financial future crumbling around him, was that the worst of it hadn't happened yet. Because when men find themselves cornered by their own mistakes, some of them turn inward and take responsibility. And some of them, desperate and frightened, start looking for somebody else to blame. It took 8 days for Ryan's fear to curdle into something uglier, and I want to tell you exactly how it happened, because I think it says something important about what desperation can do to a man who has never truly had to face consequences before in his adult life. Jessica called me first, not Ryan, which I noticed even then, the way a man notices small things when he's learned to pay attention to how people position themselves before a fight. She told me in a voice that had lost every trace of its usual polished confidence that their attorney believed I might have known about the water rights issue before the sale agreement was ever signed. She asked me directly whether that was true. I told her the truth. I told her yes, I had known because I was the one who created the severance agreement back in 1988, and it was a matter of public record the entire time, filed properly with the county for anybody who cared to look. There was a long silence on the phone after that, and then her voice changed entirely, sliding from nervous to sharp, in a way that told me their lawyers had already been discussing strategy before she ever picked up that phone to call me. She said that if I had known about a defect that significant in the property's marketability and failed to disclose it during the transfer of management authority, I might bear some legal responsibility myself for the failed transaction and the losses that followed. I sat with that accusation for a moment, turning it over the way I'd turn over any legal claim brought against a client, testing it for weight, testing it for substance. There was none. I had transferred management authority over day-to-day operations. I had never transferred nor ever agreed to transfer ownership of the water rights themselves, and nothing in any document I'd signed obligated me to volunteer information about assets that were never part of the transaction to begin with. Any competent judge would have thrown such a claim out within minutes. But Jessica wasn't finished. 2 days later, a formal demand letter arrived at my rental house on 5th Street. Delivered by a process server, their attorney had hired a pre-litigation notice raising a different concern entirely, one designed less to win in court and more to frighten an old man sitting alone in a small rented house. The letter stated in careful legal language that given my age and given what they characterized as erratic decision-making regarding the ranch's assets, they intended to petition the county probate court for a conservatorship determination, a formal legal proceeding meant to establish whether an elderly individual retains the mental capacity to manage his own financial affairs, and requesting the court appoint a conservator, presumably Ryan himself, to oversee my remaining assets going forward. Now I want you to sit with that for a moment the same way I had to sit with it reading that letter alone at my kitchen table. Some folks call that revenge. I still don't know what to call it even now. What would you call it watching your own son's name on a letter suggesting his father might not be mentally competent, simply because that father had quietly protected something that belonged to him all along? I called Nathan the moment I finished reading it, and I heard something in his voice I rarely hear from him, a controlled anger that told me even a man as measured as Nathan Cole has his limits. He told me the conservatorship threat was baseless laughably, so given that I still practiced sound judgment daily, still managed my own finances, still carried on conversations with lawyers and consultants with more clarity than most men half my age. Texas probate courts, he reminded me, require substantial medical and psychological evidence before granting a conservatorship over anyone, let alone a retired attorney with decades of documented sound legal work behind him. He told me we could respond immediately forcefully and shut the whole petition down within a week, if I wanted, likely, before it ever reached a judge's desk. I told him to draft the response, but to keep it measured. Not because I wasn't angry, and I want to be honest with you, I was angrier in that moment than I had been at any point since the padlock first went on my gate. But anger poorly aimed accomplishes nothing except giving your opponent something to point at later. What struck me most sitting there that evening after Nathan's call wasn't the legal threat itself. It was understanding with a clarity that felt almost physical exactly how far fear had pushed my son and his wife. They had started this by trying to take something from me financially. Then, without seeming to notice they were doing it, they had moved to disrespecting everything Margaret and I had built together, tearing apart a garden she'd tended for 30 years, discarding a chair carved by her own grandfather. And now, cornered and desperate, they had reached for the most serious weapon two people can turn against an elderly parent filing to strip him of his legal right to manage his own life. I sat on my small back porch that night, looking up at stars that seemed out here away from any city lights close enough to touch, and I understood that the time for patient waiting had nearly run its course. Not because I wanted revenge. I want you to hear that clearly. But because a truth this important couldn't stay sealed in a manila folder in Nathan's filing cabinet forever. Not when the people who needed to understand it most had backed themselves into a corner dark enough to threaten an old man's freedom, rather than simply admit the mistake was theirs alone to own. I asked Nathan to prepare the envelope on a Thursday morning, and I want to tell you it wasn't an act of anger, though I understood by then that Ryan and Jessica would likely receive it as one. It was in my mind simply the moment the truth I'd been protecting for 38 years had finally earned its purpose. We assembled it together in his office, the same office above the hardware store where I'd sat so many times over the previous months. Inside a plain manila envelope, we placed certified copies of the original 1988 severance agreement, notarized and recorded exactly as I'd filed it 38 years earlier. We included the geological survey maps showing the aquifer beneath the ranch, the same maps Samuel Ortiz had eventually pulled during his own due diligence work proof, laid out in scientific language that left no room for argument about where the property's actual value had always resided. We added copies of the water use permits filed through the Regional Groundwater Conservation District, every one of them recorded solely under my name. And then last of all, I wrote the letter myself by hand, the way I believed something this important deserved to be written. I won't share every word of that letter with you, because some things a father says to his son belong only between the two of them. But I will tell you the 2 lines I wrote at the very center of it, the 2 lines I'd been carrying in my mind for months before I ever put pen to paper. You thought you bought the land, I wrote. But you never understood what actually made that land worth anything at all. Rather than trust the mail with something this important, Nathan hired a local legal courier, a man who normally handled time-sensitive filings for attorneys across the county, to deliver the envelope directly to Ryan's home on Saturday morning, with a signature required upon receipt. It felt right to me having it placed directly into my son's hands, rather than left in a mailbox to be discovered whenever convenience allowed. I found out how Ryan received it through a conversation Nathan had with him 2 days later, called in as legal counsel. Once Ryan's own attorney realized the conservatorship petition had collapsed entirely under the weight of what that envelope contained. Ryan told Nathan in a voice Nathan described afterward as hollow, almost childlike, that he'd set the envelope aside all through Saturday, too anxious to open it in front of Jessica, and had finally sat down alone with it late that same night in his study, the house quiet, Jessica already asleep, unaware yet of what had arrived that morning. He read through the severance agreement, first staring at his own father's signature from 1988, a signature made when Ryan himself was only 5 years old, decades before any of this could have possibly been about him or his choices. He looked at the geological survey maps at data confirming everything the energy company's consultant had already found. And then he read the letter, my letter, sitting at his desk with his head in his hands, according to what he later admitted to Nathan, crying the way he said he hadn't cried since his mother's funeral. I want you to understand something about that moment, something I've thought about many times since. I wasn't in that room the same way I wasn't in the room when he first got that midnight phone call about the failed deal. But I believe with everything in me that this was the first moment in the entire ordeal where Ryan finally understood the difference between losing a business deal and losing his father's trust, and that the second loss cut far deeper than the first ever could. Nathan told me Ryan asked him one question that Saturday night before hanging up. He asked whether I hated him. I want you to know what I told Nathan to tell him, because I meant every word of it. I told Nathan to tell my son that I had never once, not for a single day, through any of this, stopped loving him. But love and understanding are not always the same gift, and sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is let his son feel the full weight of a mistake, so that the lesson underneath it never has to be taught a second time. The conservatorship petition disappeared within the week, quietly withdrawn, before it ever reached a judge's desk, no explanation offered, because none was needed anymore. But something else had opened up in its place, something neither Ryan nor I fully understood, yet a door that only one final difficult conversation could walk us through. Jessica called me 3 days after that envelope landed, and her voice on the phone was nothing like the woman who'd once laughed at me across my own driveway. She asked if she could come see me alone without Ryan, and something in the careful way she asked told me this wasn't going to be another legal maneuver. She arrived at my rental house on a Sunday afternoon, dressed plainly for the first time since I'd known her. No makeup, hair pulled back, simply looking more like a tired young woman than the sharp real estate professional who'd once told me the ranch belonged to the future now. We sat at my small kitchen table, the same kind of table where Ryan had once asked me to retire, though this table was smaller, older, and held none of the confidence that first conversation had carried. She told me everything had fallen apart completely. The energy company was gone for good. Their $18 million gone with them, already moving on to another parcel of land somewhere outside Odessa. The Dallas investors hadn't dropped their claim, and their attorneys were still pursuing Ryan personally for the several $100,000 they'd sunk into surveys and engineering work before the deal collapsed. The bank was reviewing Ryan's other business loans given the pending litigation, and their credit, once strong enough to finance 2 new vehicles on a signing bonus, was now flagged in ways that would follow them for years. "Please," she said, and I watched her hands shake slightly around the coffee cup I'd poured her. "Please sell us back the water rights, or let us fold them into the ranch title again somehow. If the land is whole again, we could use it as collateral, refinance something, maybe even find another buyer willing to move faster. It might be enough to settle with Dallas, get them to drop the lawsuit before it destroys what's left of Ryan's name with every bank in this state." I looked at her for a long moment before answering, and I thought about everything that had led us to this kitchen table: the padlock, the garden, the rocking chair, the conservatorship petition that had questioned whether I still deserved control over my own life. I thought about Margaret and what she might have wanted me to say in this exact moment. "Water isn't the problem," I told her finally. She looked confused, genuinely confused, the way somebody looks when the ground beneath a familiar assumption suddenly shifts. She asked me what I meant, since obviously the water was exactly the problem, the entire reason everything had collapsed around them, and the only thing standing between Ryan and a lawsuit that could follow him for years. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice as calm and even as it has always been, because there was no version of that moment that called for anything louder. "Greed is," I said. The kitchen went quiet after that, quiet enough that I could hear the old refrigerator humming in the corner, quiet enough to hear a truck passing somewhere out on the county road. Jessica sat there for a long moment, and I watched something move behind her eyes, not quite understanding yet, but close to it, close enough that I believed for the first time since all of this began that she might actually be starting to see the shape of what had happened. I told her gently, as I could manage, that the water had never been hidden from anybody. It had sat in a public record at the county courthouse for 38 years, available to any attorney, any consultant, any careful buyer who thought to ask the right question before signing away $18 million they didn't yet possess. Nobody had stolen anything from Ryan and Jessica. They had simply never stopped to ask what they were actually buying, too eager for the number at the bottom of the page to look closely at everything the number was supposed to represent. She didn't argue with me. I think by that point, she no longer had the strength to. She finished her coffee in silence, thanked me quietly for seeing her, and left without asking again about the water rights, as though some part of her already understood that the answer wasn't really about a price I might eventually name. I sat alone at that kitchen table for a long while after she left, watching the light change outside my window, thinking about how strange it is that the truest lessons in this life rarely arrive wrapped in anger or punishment. They arrive quietly in a conversation over lukewarm coffee in 2 short sentences, spoken by an old man who had waited 38 years for exactly this moment, not to win anything, but simply to be finally understood. The months that followed Jessica's visit to my kitchen table were harder on Ryan than I think any of us, even me, fully anticipated when this whole business first began. I want to walk you through what actually happened, not with any satisfaction in the telling, but because I believe understanding the full weight of consequence matters, especially for those of us who spent our working lives believing that hard work alone was enough to protect a family from its own mistakes. The lawsuit from the Dallas investors moved forward exactly the way Nathan predicted it would, methodically, expensively, and without much mercy. Ryan's attorney negotiated a settlement rather than risk a jury trial, and the number they eventually agreed to, according to what Nathan later confirmed through professional channels, came to just over $210,000, covering the surveys, the engineering assessments, and a portion of the investor's legal fees. Ryan didn't have that kind of money sitting anywhere, not after the vehicles, not after the house deposit in Austin that he'd forfeited entirely when he backed out of that purchase, losing the earnest money along with it. He sold the Ford F-150 King Ranch first, taking a loss on it the way anybody does, selling a vehicle that's barely a few months old. And Jessica sold the Tesla not long after, both of them quietly trading down to older, more modest vehicles that nobody in town seemed to comment on directly. Though I know how small towns talk even when they pretend not to notice. The construction company Ryan had built up over 12 years, a modest but respectable operation, doing residential foundation work and light commercial contracting across 3 counties, didn't survive the fallout either, not entirely. Once word of the litigation reached the regional bank that had extended him a line of credit for equipment and payroll, the loan officer called in for a review, and within 2 months that credit line had been cut in half, then eventually closed altogether once the settlement became public record through the county court filings. 2 of his longtime subcontractors, unable to get paid on time during that stretch, took their crews elsewhere, and Ryan was left running a business that was by that winter barely more than himself and 1 truck full of tools. I want you to understand, because I think it matters, that I never once acted to make any of this happen. I never called the bank. I never spoke to the investor's attorneys beyond what basic legal courtesy required through Nathan. I never told a single soul in town anything beyond what people had already pieced together on their own. What happened to Ryan happened because of choices Ryan and Jessica made, one signature at a time, long before that padlock ever went on my gate. There's a particular kind of pain that comes from watching a consequence unfold exactly the way you always suspected it might, and I felt it most sharply on a Tuesday afternoon in November, when Nathan mentioned almost in passing that Ryan had been seen at the county workforce center, filling out registration paperwork for day labor work, the kind of listing that connects unemployed tradesmen with temporary jobs hauling concrete or working roughneck shifts out on the oil rigs when a crew comes up short-handed. As a business owner, Ryan had never paid into the unemployment insurance system the way an hourly employee does, which meant there was no safety net waiting for him once his own company collapsed. Nothing but whatever daily work he could scrape together with his own 2 hands. My son, who once sat across from me at my own kitchen table with such confidence about the future, now signing up for the same kind of rough, temporary labor that men take when they've got nothing left but their willingness to work. I didn't go see him during that stretch, not because I didn't want to, but because I still believed even then that the lesson hadn't finished teaching itself. There's a difference between a man hitting bottom and a man understanding what put him there, and I wasn't sure yet which one Ryan had reached. Jessica, for her part, went back to real estate, taking a position with a firm in Midland, far less prestigious than the independent brokerage she'd once run herself, showing modest starter homes to young couples instead of negotiating million-dollar land deals. I heard through the same channels that carry most news in a county this size that she'd grown quieter, more careful, the sharp confidence that once defined her softened into something closer to caution. I sat with all of this most evenings that winter on my small back porch, watching my breath fog in the cold air, thinking about Margaret, thinking about the oak tree standing empty out on land I still legally controlled, but hadn't set foot on in months. I thought about whether I'd done the right thing, whether patience had been wisdom or simply another word for cruelty dressed up in calm clothing. I still don't have a complete answer to that question, even now telling you this story. But I know this much for certain. Consequence, real consequence, the kind that actually changes a man, rarely arrives quietly, and it almost never arrives on anybody's convenient schedule. Ryan showed up at my rental house unannounced on a Sunday morning in early spring, nearly 5 months after that conservatorship petition had first landed on my kitchen table, And I remember opening the door to find him standing there in stiff, grease-stained, fire-resistant canvas coveralls, the kind roughnecks wear out on the rigs, thin in a way I hadn't seen since he was a teenager, holding nothing in his hands but a folded handkerchief he kept turning over between his fingers. He asked if he could come in, and I stepped back and let him, and we sat at that same small kitchen table where Jessica had once begged me to sell back the water rights. Though this felt entirely different from the moment I stepped into, he didn't speak for a long while after sitting down. I made coffee the way I always do when I need something to occupy my hands, and I set a cup in front of him and waited, because I've learned over 71 years that some conversations can't be rushed toward their own beginning. When he finally spoke, his voice was rougher than I remembered, worn down by months I hadn't witnessed directly, but had heard about through Nathan and through the quiet channels of a small county where everybody eventually learns everybody else's business. He told me he'd spent the winter trying to understand exactly where things had gone wrong, and not just with the water rights, not just with the contract, but further back than that, back to conversations we'd never properly had, back to Friday nights in bleachers, and years he'd spent believing that speed and confidence were the same thing as being smart. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt, and I didn't offer forgiveness before he'd finished saying what he needed to say, because I believe forgiveness offered too quickly can sometimes cheapen the honesty a person needs to work through first. He told me he was sorry, plainly, without excuses for the padlock for the guard, for every moment he'd allowed Jessica's urgency to become his own without stopping to ask harder questions. And then he reached into the front pocket of those coveralls and set something down on the table between our two coffee cups, a small brass key worn smooth at the edges from where it had sat in a drawer or maybe a pocket for months. I recognized it immediately. It was the key to that padlock, the very one Dale had once used to keep me off my own land. Neither of us said anything about it directly. He just left it sitting there between us, and I understood without needing him to explain it, that this was as close to a full accounting as my son knew how to offer a physical return of the one thing that had started all of this, placed quietly on the table rather than buried in another apology. I told him then, and I meant every word, that I had never stopped loving him through any of it, not for a single day. Not even when that key was still turning in a lock that shouldn't have existed in the first place. I told him that love and consequence aren't opposites, no matter how much our culture likes to pretend they are. Sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is refuse to rescue a son from a lesson that needs learning. He asked me quietly, staring down at that key on the table, whether I could ever trust him again the way I once had. I told him the truth, because I think our relationship deserved nothing less than truth after everything we'd been through. I told him that trust isn't something restored in a single conversation over coffee, no matter how sincere that conversation might be. I told him trust gets rebuilt the same way this ranch had been built in the first place, one fence post at a time, one season at a time, through patient, ordinary effort that shows up again and again even when nobody's watching closely enough to notice. We didn't resolve everything that morning. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think stories that wrap up too neatly rarely reflect how real families actually heal. Ryan left that afternoon without a full reconciliation, without any promises about the ranch or the water rights or what our future together might look like. But he left, having said something true, having handed back something true. And sometimes that's the only beginning available to two people who've hurt each other as deeply as we had. Over the following months, he started coming by more regularly, sometimes just to help me repair a section of fence that had fallen into disrepair during my time away from the property, sometimes just to sit on that small back porch and talk about nothing important at all. It wasn't the relationship we'd once had, and I'm not sure it ever fully could be. But it was something honest, built slowly, and honest has always mattered more to me than easy. I kept that little brass key afterward in the same drawer where I once kept the folder on the water rights, a reminder of exactly how far we'd both come to get back to something resembling trust. A full year passed between that first quiet reconciliation and the afternoon I finally decided what to do with the water rights I'd protected for 38 years, and I spent a good portion of that year thinking carefully about the decision, because I understood better than most that how a man distributes what he's built says everything about what he actually valued while he was building it. I called Samuel Ortiz myself that spring, the same water rights consultant who'd originally uncovered the severance agreement during his due diligence work for the energy company, and I asked him a question he probably wasn't expecting from the man whose paperwork had once ended an $18 million deal. I asked him if he knew of any local agricultural cooperative in our county that might benefit from a stable, permanently protected water source, something that could serve small family farms rather than a single large landowner or corporate buyer. Ortiz knew exactly the group I needed. A cooperative of 11 small farming families across our county, and the one bordering it, most of them running modest operations of 50 to 200 acres. Families who'd been struggling for years against the same unpredictable water access that had once destroyed those 3 ranching families back during the drought of 1987. Families who understood better than almost anybody left in this part of Texas exactly what it means to farm land without a guaranteed source of water beneath it. Before we ever sat down with the cooperative, I spent several sessions with Nathan working through a detail most people wouldn't think to consider, but one that mattered enormously to me given everything I'd learned across 30 years of practicing this kind of law. Texas follows what's known as the rule of capture when it comes to groundwater, and simply granting the cooperative ownership of the water rights beneath my land wouldn't automatically give them any legal right to actually walk onto that surface land, drill their wells, or run pipeline across it, especially once that surface land eventually passed to Ryan. Without addressing that gap properly, I would have been handing 11 families a valuable asset they had no practical way to reach, setting up exactly the kind of neighbor dispute I'd spent my whole career trying to help other families avoid. So Nathan and I drafted something more careful than a simple grant. We built in a permanent recorded limited surface easement restricted specifically to the unfarmed margins along the eastern and northern boundary lines. Narrow strips of land Ryan would never need for grazing or crops, allowing the cooperative legal access to install and maintain their well infrastructure and pipeline routes without ever setting foot on the pasture land Ryan would one day inherit and depend on for his cattle. It took considerably longer to finalize than a simple transfer would have, but I wanted this gift to arrive without a single loose thread that could someday unravel into the same kind of conflict that had already cost this family so much. I met with the cooperative's representatives on a Thursday afternoon at Nathan's office. 5 men and 2 women, weathered and careful in the particular way people get when they've spent their whole lives depending on something as unpredictable as West Texas weather. I explained what I was offering: a permanent, irrevocable grant of the water rights beneath my 600 acres, along with the surface easements necessary to actually use them, structured through the cooperative so that no single family could ever sell it off individually, protecting it the same way I'd protected it myself for nearly 4 decades. I watched their faces while Nathan read through the terms, and I saw something in their expressions I hadn't seen in a long time. Not disbelief exactly, but a kind of careful, earned gratitude. The particular reaction of people who understand precisely what they're being given because they've spent their entire lives without it. Ryan was there that day too, sitting quietly toward the back of the room, having asked if he could simply observe, and I'd said yes, believing he deserved to witness this decision, even though it wasn't going to include him directly. After the meeting ended and the cooperative's representatives had shaken my hand and left, Ryan stayed behind, and he asked me the question I'd been expecting for months. Why them, he asked. And I want you to understand There wasn't bitterness in his voice when he asked it, only genuine curiosity, the question of a man who had finally learned enough humility to ask rather than assume. Because they know the value of what they receive, I told him. He nodded slowly, and I watched him actually sit with that answer, instead of arguing against it, the way the old Ryan might have back before that padlock. Back before he understood what it costs a person to finally learn something the hard way. I explained to him gently that this wasn't a punishment aimed at him, and it never had been. I told him that the ranch itself, the surface land, the fences, the pasture where his mother used to walk every evening, all of that would still come to him one day, exactly as it always would have, and that the easements we'd built into the agreement had been designed specifically so his future herd would never lose a single usable acre to the cooperative's pipelines. But the water, the thing beneath it, all that made the land worth anything that I was choosing to give somewhere else, to people who had never once assumed it, simply came bundled with everything around it. Ryan sat quietly for a long moment after I finished, and then he said something that stayed with me long after we left Nathan's office that afternoon. He said he understood now why I'd waited so long to tell him any of it, and he said in a voice steadier than I'd heard from him in over a year that he was grateful in a strange and complicated way for every hard month it had taken him to arrive at that understanding. I drove out to the ranch alone on an evening in early autumn, nearly 2 years after that first padlock ever appeared on my gate, and I parked my old Ford pickup beneath the oak tree in the exact spot where I used to park it. Coming home after a long day beside Margaret, back through all the ordinary seasons of a marriage that shaped over 40 years of my life. Seasons I still carry with me every time I turn off that engine in this particular patch of shade. The cooperative had already begun drilling their first well under the new water agreement, a modest operation on the parcel closest to the county line, and Samuel Ortiz had told me just that week that early testing showed the aquifer beneath my land held more capacity than anybody had initially estimated, enough to support all 11 families for generations if managed carefully the way I'd always believed it should be managed. I sat beneath that oak tree for a long while as the sun went down, the same way Margaret used to sit there every evening with her glass of sweet tea, and I found myself talking to her out loud, the way I sometimes do when nobody else is around, to hear an old man's foolishness. I told her about Ryan, about the slow, patient work of rebuilding trust one fence post at a time. I told her about the cooperative, about 11 families who would never again have to watch their cattle die of thirst, the way we'd watched happen to our neighbors back in 1987. I told her I hoped wherever she was that she understood I'd tried my best to honor everything we'd built together, even when honoring it meant making choices that hurt the people we loved most, before those choices ever had the chance to heal anything. I think about faith more now than I used to, sitting out here alone in the evenings, watching light fall across land that has outlasted every single person who's ever tried to claim it belonged to them completely. I've come to believe that some kind of larger hand guides the timing of these things. The drought that taught me the value of water when I was young, the quiet 1988 decision that protected this family decades before any of us understood why it mattered, the patient unfolding of consequence that eventually taught my own son something I could never have taught him with words alone. I don't know exactly what to call that guiding hand, and I'm not sure it matters much whether I ever find the precise name for it. I only know I'm grateful for it the way I'm grateful for every hard season that eventually gave way to something worth harvesting. Ryan and I aren't fully what we once were to each other, and I've stopped expecting that we ever will be exactly that again. What we have now is quieter, more honest, built through ordinary Sunday afternoons, fixing fences together, rather than grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations. I've learned to be grateful for that too, because I understand now better than I did even a few years ago that the ordinary patient rebuilding of something broken is its own kind of grace, maybe the truest kind, available to people like us. I want to thank you, whoever you are listening to an old rancher, tell you about water and greed and a family that nearly broke itself apart before it learned how to bend instead. I hope something in this story found its way to you the way these old truths eventually found their way to my son. Not through anger, not through punishment, but through patience and time and a willingness to let consequence teach what words alone never could. If this story meant something to you tonight, I'd be grateful if you'd consider liking it, subscribing for more stories like this one, and sharing it with somebody in your own life who might need to hear it. And if you believe in something larger than yourself, the way I've come to more firmly with each passing year, I hope you'll say a quiet word of thanks tonight for whatever water runs beneath your own life, seen or unseen, protected or still waiting to be understood. Thank you for sitting with me through this one. I'm grateful for the company.